On July 4th, 1826, two of our nation's founding fathers died. The same day, within hours of each other. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, the second and third presidents of the United States, passed away on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Now, Adams and Jefferson, they were close friends. They had met at the Continental Congress, and even though they differed politically at times, they visited often and they corresponded by letter. There is an asterisk in this story, and it's a big one. Their friendship took a tough blow when Adams ran for a second term as president, and Thomas Jefferson ran against him. Jefferson won the election, but the campaign, it was bitter, it was filled with insults and personal attacks. Both became angry with each other. In fact, it is said that Adams left town even before the inauguration. The two refused to speak to each other for more than a decade. Finally, one of Jefferson's neighbors visited Adams in Massachusetts. He left that meeting, and it was said, according to this neighbor, that Adams had made this comment. He said, "I've always loved Jefferson and still love him." Now, when Jefferson heard that, his response was wonderful because he wrote, "This is enough for me. I only needed this knowledge to revive towards him all the affections of the most cordial moments of our lives." So the two began to write each other again. They had correspondence with one another, able to stay in contact with one another, even up to the point of their death. It's an amazing story. I guess it's because so few stories end this way, where you have someone that they have camaraderie, they have a friendship, but something happens. There's a division in the friendship. There's something that has been a source of that conflict. But to watch them repair that fractured friendship and to finish strong, that is the rarity. It's rare today, but it's rare through, it seems, all of history. When we go back and we look, even to the days of Scripture. I'm thinking about our lesson for tonight that takes us all the way back to 1 Samuel. Just need you to think of these three words if they're not on your outline, and I don't think they are, so go ahead and write those down. Anger, jealousy, and bitterness. Anger, jealousy, and bitterness. Here's the thing. They destroy things. They destroy friendships, marriages, families. And in the case tonight, we'll see that this type of anger, jealousy, and bitterness, it threatened an entire nation. We've seen this unfortunate reality play out in our daily Bible reading over the past week because Saul was Israel's first king. He came in on really a difficult time. We think back to the days of Moses, the great lawgiver, the one who received the Old Testament law from God and who was the one who was the leader of the people as he led them out of Egypt and through the wilderness. We think about great leaders like Joshua, Moses' successor, who was able to lead the Israelites across the Jordan into the Promised Land as they went from city to city and claimed victory. And it allowed the different tribes to make their home and to settle in those new home places. Then there was the period of the Judges. The book of Judges is interesting. We talked about that cycle of sin, oppression, where they call out for help and God brings a judge. And that went about for a dozen or so times. A lot of conflict, not a lot of peace, a lot of battle. There was a difficult season. The Israelites called for a leader. Samuel is this religious leader, is this spiritual leader. He's one following the Lord, and he's the one that is named Saul to be Israel's first king. By the way, they found him hiding out in the baggage, but still we have high hopes for him. Because maybe it was what the nation needed. Maybe the nation needed this strong leader or king who throughout, day by day, would provide direction and leadership for the nation. Maybe that would be what would help them to reach their finest moment. Could have been. But that's not really the way it transpired. What we see in Saul's life, and tonight I wanted to say that we're putting David and Saul's life side by side, but I really don't think that that's an accurate statement. What we're doing is we're talking about really the time where their lives intersect, and it's just quite the conflict, and it's because of anger, jealousy, and bitterness. Those are really three of the big causes, and we'll look at that. What we find when we put David and Saul side by side is just two totally different leaders. So we want to acknowledge that. We're going to begin tonight by looking at some of the things that Saul did. Some of his bad decisions, some of his rash decisions, just an act of disobedience. We're going to look at how he responded to David's success. I know some of this goes back to last week's Bible reading, but it's okay. We need this, and the part where it was from, beyond the week, while we'll try to move through that quicker to keep us in this past week's Bible reading. All right, we remember this, 1 Samuel 13, verse 1, that Saul was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel for 42 years. We see Saul, introduced to Saul, about 1 Samuel chapter 9. Here's the thing, his reign was filled with bad decisions, anger, jealousy, and fear. The story is fast-moving, it's out of control, and it is a downward spiral. Very few points did I read through 1 Samuel and think, you know what? Saul's going to pull out of this. I never had that impression. So we want to see that and to notice that, see if we can learn lessons from that. All right, so let's begin in 1 Samuel chapter 13. Israelites are about to face off against the Philistines. Chapter 13, verse 7, Saul remained at Gilgal. All the troops with him were quaking with fear. He waited 7 days, the time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and Saul's men began to scatter. So he said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the fellowship offering." And Saul offered up the burnt offering. As Saul did that, Samuel arrived, and Samuel rebuked Saul. Remember this sentence standing out: "You acted foolishly." Samuel's rebuking the king. I know this was early in the story, but it is when Saul found out that his kingdom would not endure, because God was going to seek a man after his own heart to lead Israel. Saul's son Jonathan, he was quite a warrior, a brave warrior. In chapter 14, the Israelites attacked the Philistines. Chapter 14, verse 24 says, "Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies.' So none of the troops tasted food." All right, so we want to hang on to that for just a second, because Jonathan did not hear his father issue that order. Jonathan and his armor bearer went about, and they won a pretty decisive victory on their own. And as Jonathan was out, he came across a honeycomb. So he used a stick and he got some, and he tasted it. Scripture says his eyes brightened. When soldiers found out that Jonathan had eaten the honey, they made him aware of what that edict was. And it's interesting to see Jonathan's response when he found out about his father's order about don't eat the food. He said, "My father has made trouble for the country." When they all came back together and Saul found this out, Saul was determined he was going to live up to what his order was. It was going to cost Jonathan his life. But the men stepped up and they took up for Jonathan. So much so that the king spared Jonathan's life. So what we see is we see this just really a bad decision in chapter 13. We see a rash decision in chapter 14. But the word foolish, it kind of comes to mind in both. was a foolish decision in chapter 13. He's making trouble for his country in chapter 14. Then we come to chapter 15. Saul and the Israelites are facing the Amalekites. Now, Samuel had this directive for Saul going into that battle. Now go, attack the Amalekites, and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death the men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. Is there any part about that statement that's difficult to understand? I just don't think so. Saul won the battle of the day. The thing is that Saul did not obey the word of the Lord. He didn't obey the word of the Lord. Samuel again rebuked Saul for his disobedience. This time, Saul was devastated and he was confessing his sin. He reached out, because Samuel was like, I'm out, I'm gone, and he begins to leave. Saul reaches out and grabs the hem of his garment, so much so that it tore Samuel's garment. And he pleaded with him. He said, please honor me in front of my men. Please come and worship with me. Which leaves an awful lot of discussion there of, how much was Saul devastated by what was going to happen? Because again, it was reiterated, you're not going to survive. Your kingdom will not reign forever. But how much was it that Saul was just interested in how he appeared before people? I think there's room for both there. Scripture does say that Samuel went and worshiped with Saul. An interesting discussion there, an interesting course of events. Tonight's lesson could really be summed up in 2 verses. And it's in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him, David, in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Samuel then went to Ramah. Remember that statement. The Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. Next verse. Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. If we want to see the difference in these 2 kings, those 2 verses sum it up. Spirit of the Lord was with David. The Spirit of the Lord had departed Saul. And we see that. We see that in Saul's actions. I want to even just kind of use the word bizarre, really, over the chapters ahead. Some of the things that he does, the way that he's acting. It's interesting when we look at the story in this context. Chapter 17, it's important, David versus Goliath. But it's not the big story, at least not tonight it's not. Now I am reminded, as Saul was always, it seemed like we've read so far, that if he watched the men be fearful, he became fearful. If he saw them getting ready to leave and to scatter, boy, it caused him to scramble to do things differently. But when David showed up, and Goliath had been coming out and just taunting the Israelites, do you remember the words that David said? David stood up. He wasn't sitting here trying to get other, hey, wait, y'all come back. Hey, don't leave now. No, he faced Goliath, face to face. David said to that Philistine, he said, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down, and I will cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not only by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. And with one smooth stone, a slingshot, and pretty good aim, David took Goliath down. The battle belonged to the Lord. The Israelites found courage, and it was a great defeat that day. The nation responded to that act of heroism just like we would think they would. When we look forward in the next chapter, chapter 18, beginning in verse 6, the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine. The women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. That verse tells us how the people responded. But it's the next few verses ahead that give us an indication of how Saul responded. And I have to tell you, these are probably, again, some of the most critical verses in this story of Saul and David, because it's during this time that things begin to escalate. Let's look at that. We're going to go down to verse 8 and read through verse 12. All right, catch the key words with me. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? He's threatened. He's angry. He's threatened. He's jealous. From that time on, David kept a close eye on, or Saul rather, kept a close eye on David. Verse 10. The next day, an evil spirit from God came forcibly on Saul. He was prophesying in his house while David was playing the lyre, as he usually did. Saul had a spear in his hand, and he hurled it, saying to himself, I'll pin David to the wall. But David eluded him twice. Saul didn't just do it once, he did it twice, trying to harm David. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with David but had departed from Saul. Did you notice some of the key terms there? Anger. I think about where we read, and I just come out with the word jealousy. Evil spirit tried to harm David. He was afraid of David. Very interesting. So what happens over the next few chapters? In chapter 19, Saul attempted to kill David. Now, to further complicate the story, David had married one of Saul's daughters, Michal, and she actually helped David escape to keep from being harmed by Saul. In chapter 20, to complicate matters more, David had a very special friendship with Jonathan, Saul's son. In fact, it's one of the most beautiful friendships. In chapter 20 of 1 Samuel is a beautiful read to find out the closeness that if you will, a brother can have for brother. They shared these things in common, and just a powerful reading, a powerful story. But then when you get to chapter 21 through about 23, I mean, David's just continually on his run. He's continually running from Saul. But then when we get to chapter 24, and again in chapter 26, David has an opportunity to even the score. Given the threat level, we might have understood if David had chosen to take advantage of the moment. But David saw things from a different perspective. I want us to look at 1 Samuel chapter 24, verse 8. Then David went out of the cave. This is one of the two times when David had an opportunity to harm Saul and chose not to. David came out of the cave, called to Saul. Let's try that again. Then David went out of the cave and called to Saul, "My lord the king." When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. He said to Saul, "Why do you listen when men say, 'David is bent on harming you'? This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Someone urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lay my hand on my Lord, because He is the Lord's anointed. See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but I did not kill you. See that there is nothing in my hand to indicate I am guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May the Lord judge between you and me. May the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. You talk about the difference between two leaders. There we see it. We see the difference of anger, jealousy, and bitterness, and a man of true character. A man that will ultimately be described as a man after God's own heart. This is the contrast that we're seeing in the man that will ultimately lead Israel. One other story tonight, it goes to chapter 28. Saul is just at an interesting point. Now, by this time, Samuel has passed away. Saul arranges to be able to go to a witch, to a medium, in an effort to try to bring back Samuel from the dead so that he can talk to him. And it happens. God allowed it to happen. But we need to hear what took place in this rather interesting moment in Saul's life. Samuel said to Saul, "Why do you consult me now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy?" I think that's the part that Saul is continuing to have trouble with, coming to terms with. The Lord has departed from you. Your reign will not survive. The Lord has done what He predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out His fierce wrath against the Amalekites. The Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hand of the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines. Saul's story came to a tragic end in 1 Samuel chapter 31. Saul's sons were killed in battle. Saul was wounded critically. He ultimately fell on his own sword. The Israelites fled their homes. Philistines invaded the territory. And it is one of the saddest endings to a story that at the beginning was filled with such potential. But it is what happens when Saul refused to listen and to obey the Lord. It's what happens when he made rash decisions. It's what happens when he disobeyed the Lord. And when he continued to see David as this bitter enemy that needed to be taken out. And now by this point, David was the Lord's anointed. But David continued to respond with such great character. What a sad ending. 42 years of reign, by the way. And that's the final chapter. Beginning next week, because we're really just at the beginning of David's story, he'll take the throne in 2 Samuel, and we'll find out more about that. I find this interesting. This is from a sermon by David Owens. He notes that the only one in Scripture to be called a man after God's own heart is David. He is also mentioned more than any other biblical character except Jesus. These are numbers from David Owens, and I trust him. He says it mentions that Abraham is mentioned in 14 chapters in the Bible, Elijah in 10 chapters of the Bible, David 66 chapters in the Bible. And he adds on top of that 59 references to David in the New Testament. The Bible has a lot to say about David. So we'll be spending some time with him, following him through his reign, to watch him in his victorious moments, but to watch him go through some of his most painful disappointments at times when he disobeyed the word of the Lord. But through that we will see something very important about David, of what made him a man after God's own heart. What is it that makes him different? We look forward to seeing that, of what made David a man after God's own heart.